Getting it right in camera. There were notes for this, but don't be alarmed if you don't. If you came in late, then know that you can download them later and print them off. And they're not long, like 5 pages. And if I talk about stuff that isn't on the notes, then I'll say, hey, this isn't on the notes. You might want to jot this down. Alrighty. So again, for those who are coming in, and if you're a proficient photographer, whether hobbyist or professional, and you are rocking your camera and you're getting it right all the time, and every time you take a picture, it's exactly what you want it to be, the exposure's right. I mean, the only thing you might have trouble with is white balance off and on, because that's just the nature of white balance. But then this session may not be for you. I'm just letting you know. I'm not trying to chase anybody away, but I don't want anybody to be bored and feel like I wasted your time. I respect everybody's time, so I'm trying to tell you up front, if you're a proficient photographer and you're happy with all of your pictures, exposure is good, focus is good, then take a break, come back and see us at 7 o'clock for editing in Lightroom. And that's my last little warning. Okay, so when you're talking about photography, and people are having problems, whether their pictures are underexposed or overexposed or blurry or what have you, they probably don't understand the fundamental exposure triangle. And you can say that to somebody. And we at Pretty Presets, we have a lot of people who just got a camera, their big girl camera or their big boy camera, that they upgrade from just their phone or a point and shoot to a big DSLR, and they shoot in auto if they have a camera that allows that, or they just trial and error, and they really are kind of feeling their way through the dark for a while. I was there. I remember what that was like. So they really don't understand what all goes into getting a great picture. So we're going to talk about that, and that's the exposure triangle. Well, what the heck is this exposure triangle? It's three things: the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And all three of those things are going to work together every time you take a picture. Okay, every time you take a picture. If something's not right, if your aperture isn't where it needs to be, your picture could be blurry, or it could be too bright or too dark. Shutter speed, if it's not fast enough, or if it's not slow enough, well, you're not going to have the exposure you want, or you might have blurriness because of the shutter speed. So we're going to talk about each of those things. So the exposure triangle is ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And there will be pictures. There will always be text. Okay. So ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. How much you allow your camera to see. There was somebody who was at, I can't remember his name now. My brain's not working right. Anyway, they talked about it in terms of like fireflies. And the higher the number, the more fireflies you kind of had there. And so your picture is going to be brighter. The less fireflies, darker. Well, it's not exactly that. That's not an exact correlation there. It means how much light you're allowing your camera to see. So if your ISO is low, you're saying, hey, there's already a lot of light. I don't want you to be very sensitive to it. High ISO means you're letting in lots of light, or you're making it very sensitive to it. I think about it in terms of sunglasses. If you're using you use a low ISO when you're shooting in bright light. So out in daylight, bright light, you can use a low ISO. You're going to use a high ISO if it's very overcast, or if the sun's going down and it's very dim. If you're indoors, you're going to use a high ISO. Right now I'm telling you the grammar of photography in terms of shooting. This is the grammar of it, and then we're going to talk about how to put it together. We're going to talk about using high ISO and how it can affect noise, and we will talk about that. And I just have some examples, and they're kind of old because both these little girls are much older now. And so here on the left is my niece Delaney when she was 5 or so. And you can see we're outside in the daylight. So my ISO is much lower. It's 250. Okay? 250 is my ISO, and we still have a well-exposed image. My shutter speed is good. And on the right is my niece Sarah. This is about 4 years ago. And the sun has gone down, or pretty much, it's barely any light. We're out in the woods. I am really hurting for light. I had a reflector, But still, so I had to bump up my ISO, and look how slow my shutter speed is. And we'll reference this picture again later. But so I had to have a really slow shutter speed, and my ISO is actually almost as high as I could go on that particular camera. Okay, again, we're just going to go over the fundamentals, and we're going to talk about how it all plays together. So aperture, that is how wide open your lens is. And a small f number, like 1.8 or 2, means that lens is wide open, almost as wide as it can get, and it's trying to just let in a lot of light. And then a large f number, like f16, f22, that lens is much more closed. The opening is much more closed down. It's like barely a hole. It's a little pin light, and it's letting in very little light. Why does that matter? Well, if you have a wide open aperture, not only does it allow a lot of light in, but it also gives you a shallow depth of field, which we'll talk about. And meaning just like the focus. So if you're taking a picture of a flower, just that flower would be in focus, and maybe the fence behind it would be out of focus. So it's great for that. And it lets in more light. So if you're in a dark, like when I was in the woods with my niece, I was in a dark area, I had a wider aperture to let in more light. The narrower apertures, the smaller, it's going to close down more light. So if you're in a really bright, like in the middle of the day, you'd want to use a higher aperture number because it's going to close down and close up some of that light. But also if you're doing a landscape or a group, you're going to want to use a narrow aperture because it gives us more focus. It's going to focus on what it hits, where your focus point is, and go on further back. Okay, it's not going to stop. It has a very long depth of field, not a shallow depth of field, but it's going to go deep. And here's some examples. So you see f1.4 over on the left, it's wide open, and then as our numbers get bigger, the wide opening, the area in the middle, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. All right, so I'm just looking at my notes that I've had here. And we're going to talk more about how these fit together. Going back to aperture, I forgot to mention that if you remember film days, if you're old enough, I know we have some people probably not old enough to remember film days, you would go into the store and buy film like 400 or 800 or 100, and that would be based on your needs. So 400 is kind of multi-purpose, indoor, outdoor. 100 would be outdoor, 800 would be indoor. And you'd have to change your film as you went out. Well, I never shot a DSLR with a film, but I did have a little point and shoot cameras. And I would buy the film to suit what my needs of where I was going to be shooting. Wedding photographers would have to change film as they went in and out of the church. You know, if they're taking outdoor pictures, then going back in for reception, they'd have to change their film. But we could just get to push a button and change our ISO. After we talked about aperture, I want to quickly talk about focus systems because it's a piece of the puzzle that most people don't realize. And that when you're looking in your camera, so if you have a camera and then you press the shutter button just halfway down, you're going to see like a little red box or a little red circle, and that's where your focal point is at that time. And that's what, if you put that little red box over something like a water bottle, that water bottle is what's going to be in focus and not anything else. But there are different ways that little box is determined. One is single point, okay, uses the focal points where you can move the focal points around with the back wheel or they're called different things on a Canon and Nikon and all the different cameras, but the back area, you can pick your focal point. The camera focuses just on that subject, wherever that, you can, if you have a subject like a person, you would move that focal point, that little red box, till it's over that person. Dynamic area, where users select focus points manually, but the camera will focus based on information surrounding from surrounding focus points if a subject leaves the selected point. So it's kind of more of a smart focus, and it can change. I don't use this. I use the single point, but read your manual and read that. And it might be different because this is based off a Nikon from a few years ago. So Canon might be a little bit different, but usually you do have a single point. closest subject, and I'm pretty sure you have the dynamic area on Canon as well. But closest subject, this means, oops, and it's not supposed to be Canon there, it's supposed to be camera. The camera focuses on the thing closest to it, okay? So if I have a flower in some flowers and then I've got a person behind them, they're going to focus on the flowers instead of the person behind it. And I made a huge mistake one time when I was getting my camera and I went to take some pictures of some babies for a friend of mine, a baby, and the baby would keep lifting his foot out and my focus would land on the foot because the camera was set to closest subject, and it was very, very frustrating. And then auto area, the camera automatically detects the subject and selects the focal point. And that can work at times, and then at times it doesn't work so well. But when you're going to be talking about metering, that single point is what you're going to want. Okay, so if you don't know how to figure out, I don't know where to change the focal point, look in your menu system. But a lot of cameras have it on the outside as well, a button on the outside. But for the entry levels, you may have to go in and change that to single point in the menu system. And here's an example. So I have this chain, and my focal point was right there, and that's what got in focus. So everything in front of it and everything behind it was out of focus. I'm going to take questions, I promise. Okay. Oh, let me go back. So see it's F2, because that point, that's as wide open as that particular lens could go, I'm pretty sure. Or maybe it was 1.8 and I had it at 2. And so that's that. And because I wanted a very blurry, I wanted lots of bokeh. Bokeh is the blurry circles you see in the back where it's all like little globes of light. And this is an example of a very narrow aperture, f16. So it was very bright with all the snow and the clear skies and the sun. So I used f16. My ISO is 100. And the focus point, I focused on the swing, but see, even the house and barn and trees in the background are in focus because that is that aperture that is very specific, okay? And it's very deep. It's going to keep going on deeper. Now, even if I'd used a smaller aperture, some of that would be in focus, but not as crisp as it is with this one. I don't have an, this was taken years ago, I don't have an example to show, but, and I'm not going to talk about the depth of field calculator and all that stuff, confuse you. Shutter speed. So shutter speed is how long your shutter is open. So if you have, and it's always a fraction, okay, like 1/200th of a second. But when you're in your camera, when you're looking in your camera, and on a Nikon, it's the far left, and I believe it's the same on the Canon. So if you're looking in your viewfinder and you see a number like 50 on the far left, that's 1/50th of a second. If it says 1600, that's 1/1600th of a second. So that's your shutter speed, and that's how long it's taking it to open and close back down. And you want it to be fast, generally, if you're having a human subject, because humans move and breathe, and we just move. And plus, if you're holding your camera, you've got some handshake, and you're going to move, and it'll be a little blurry. So you want a fast shutter speed. So let me reiterate this because people often are confused with this. When you look, if you hold your camera, so I have my camera in my hand, and I turn it on, and I depress the shutter halfway, okay? On the far left, right now mine says 400. So that means that my shutter speed is 1/400th of a second. It doesn't mean it's right. That means that's what it is. That's the last picture I took. That was the shutter speed of the last picture I took, which was outdoors. So right now, if I metered, it's going to be a lot slower because I'm indoors. However, that's the last one I saw. So when you're metering, which I'm going to explain what that is, that shutter speed is going to move. I'll have people I'll try and explain everything, and they're like, but that number is moving. How do you get it to stay the same? So, well, when you meter, it's supposed to move. And the shutter speed, if you have lots of light, you want your shutter speed should be fast because you don't want to blind that sensor. You're trying to make it open and close really fast so that too much light doesn't come in. We don't want to flood it and overexpose the image. And then if you have really poor light, low light, then your shutter speed is going to be slow. So when I went out and took some architectural pictures for my husband, and I went towards the sunset, and I had to have a very slow shutter speed. I actually did it on a timer, and it would be like some of them were 30 seconds. So I just did the timer, and then it would take the picture. But it was trying to allow in as much light. It's just keeping it open, and it's just saying, come on, light, come on in, come on in, come on in. And when it gets to where it has enough light, it takes that picture. Okay. Shutter speeds can also freeze action, like if you're spraying water and that water can just freeze in time. Or if you're trying to show motion of a car racing by or a child on a bike racing by, that shutter speed can show the motion, because if your shutter speed is a little slow for that, then it's going to catch that movement going across. Now, last thing about shutter speed. Shutter speed is usually the number one reason people's pictures are out of focus. It's not always the main reason, but it is usually. People send me pictures and say, I'm really struggling with my focus. Can you help me? And I'll say, well, I need to see the EXIF data, the ISO, the shutter speed, aperture. And sure enough, their shutter speed is not appropriate for their pictures. So how to keep that. So one rule of tip is on the bottom here, and I think I have it on the notes. Keep the shutter speed at twice the focal length of your lens. Okay, it's the bottom of page 3. Keep the shutter speed at twice the focal length of your lens. So if you're shooting with a lens of, say, 85 millimeter, then you want to keep it, for that one, let's just round to 90. So we want at least 1/180th of a second. And as you adjust your settings, if that goes lower, then you'll need to do things to help adjust it to keep it up there. Or put your camera on a tripod. Okay? Those are some things you can do, and we'll talk about those. But usually, shutter speed, people are just using shutter speeds that are not appropriate. They have a moving subject, or they're hand holding, or what have you. Okay, here's an example. And I slowed down my shutter speed, and it was 35 millimeter, f5, ISO 400. I slowed it down to 1/40th. And it really was too slow for my moving and breathing son and myself moving and breathing, hand holding the camera. And if you zoom in with this, it looks like it's in focus when you're pulled back, but if you zoom in, that's not in focus. It's just a little soft. It's not terrible. You could probably fix this enough to make it work, in post-processing. So I'm not saying that's terrible, because you can have more out of focus pictures than that, but it is a little soft, and it's because I was hand holding it and the shutter speed was too slow. Now, yes, outdoors I could have definitely made it faster, but I was doing this for illustration. Okay, so metering. This is where they all come together. Metering is what you do. I'm just going to cut to the chase with this one. There's a little wheel. For a Nikon, it's the little wheel under your thumb. And for a Canon, I believe it's right over your finger. I actually have a Canon at home, and I don't use it that frequently, but it's right under your forefinger. You're going to move that back and forth. Oh, I can't remember. Stinks. I haven't used my Canon in so long. Anyway, I'll read. I'm sure somebody's going to like me with a Canon. So if you have a Canon, tell me if it's the back wheel or if it's the wheel right under your forefinger, and I'll read those. So we're going to move that wheel, whatever it's under your thumb or under your forefinger, and we're going to adjust things to suit the image. So I'm trying to put this all together. All right, I'm trying to think of a good way to say all this. I'm going to stop right now and just talk more grammar here. So types of metering, we have spot metering, we have center weighted metering, and we have matrix metering, or evaluative. So with spot, it's taking a very specific area, and it uses your focal point. I don't know why I said focal points. It's your one focal point to pick your spot, and that's where it's going to measure the light. It's like a light, it is a light meter. It's going to read the light on that spot. Center weighted takes the middle and then goes out a little distance from the center, and that's what it's going to judge off of. And then matrix or evaluative is going to read the light over several different spots on the image. So it's going to read the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, and the center, and it's going to do like an average. I almost always use spot metering, but there are times matrix and center weighted works best. Group portraits, center weighted works really well. Landscapes, I always use matrix because I want it to read the overall. This is what they look like. So if you have a camera, this is on a Nikon. So the matrix looks like the one on the left. Center weighted looks like a solid circle in the middle with the 2 parentheses on the outside. And then spot is just one spot. And on Canon, I know this is a little bit different. Okay, I know this is a little bit different. But your spot metering is there, your center weighted is there, and your evaluative is there. But I think the pictures for it are a little bit different. And again, I know if you're brand new, a lot of this is like, I don't really understand, but we're going to go back over it and we're going to illustrate it. So metering off, when we're metering, we're reading the light. So when we look through there, if you see some little tick marks, and I used to have a little picture of the tick marks, and I don't know where it went now that I'm thinking about it. If you look through your camera right now, hopefully you have your camera with you, and you depress your shutter halfway, there is a little line graph at the bottom that have little tick marks. Okay, little tick marks. And you might have a 0 over the middle. Your goal is to have the tick mark go up under the 0, under the middle, and not be off to the left and not be off to the right. And we will use that little scroll button under our thumb or over our forefinger, under our forefinger, to get that line under the 0. Again, it might not be a 0, but whatever the middle, whatever is the top, over the top of your middle of your little line graph, it's just a little bit of little tick marks when you look through your viewfinder. Okay, when you put your eye up and you depress it halfway, which I'm doing right now, so if my voice sounds like it moves farther away, it's because I'm sticking my camera in front of my face. All right, so now your goal is to move that to the middle after you have set all of your settings. So after I decided my ISO for this picture you're looking at, and after I decided what aperture I wanted to use, so I set my ISO and I set my aperture. Then I have my single point focus. I'm going to put it somewhere on the subject, and then I'm going to meter. I don't pick a shutter speed. That's not my goal here, because I'm going to make the shutter speed fit what it needs to be to have a well-exposed picture. So if you look at the left picture, I metered off the cheek in the shadow, which made it too bright. So imagine like see where her earring is, and if you go over to the left a little bit, I metered off of that cheek underneath her eye. Well, it read darkness. So my camera thought, oh, this is dark, so I need to make it brighter. And when I metered, I moved under my thumb on a Nikon, I moved my little thumb and got it over to where it was under the 0, and I took the picture. Problem is it made the rest of her too bright because it was trying to brighten up that dark area. So instead, when I metered, I said, oh, that's too bright. Meter off the cheek closer to the light. So this time I might have metered off her forehead or her cheek that's closer to the light. Now I have a better exposed picture. Yes, some of her is in shadow, but that's okay. But overall, it's a better picture. It's not overexposed. The left one is too bright. So let me be clear. My little focal point that's in my camera when I look through it, I have it on single point. I've had that setting. Okay, I set my metering to that one circle, solid circle. I put that focal point over her cheek or her forehead, and then after I've set my ISO probably to 400, ISO is probably 3.2 or something like that. I mean aperture. And then I use the little wheel button. And that is what most people are missing. If you're here because your pictures are overexposed or underexposed all the time, that is what you're missing. I've done in-person photography workshops several times, and almost every time when they realize it is the little tick marks that they need to be getting under the 0, they're always like, oh, now I understand. So people are usually missing getting it under the middle. All right, let's keep going here. So mechanics of metering. This is what I did. I evaluate my light. Okay, is it consistent all the way around? Are you in the shade with bright light in the background? Is it golden hour? Is your subject in front of the setting sun? Like, so they're going to be dark? Are you trying to capture a busy toddler? Spot metering is going to be really hard if they're moving subject. So with a moving target, I just do like center weighted. That's what I do. And I don't use a real shallow aperture. So you're not going to use an aperture that's like 1.8 or 2.0 for a moving subject. You're going to pick something that's a little bit deeper. So if they move, it's going to go further back. Pick your mode, busy subject, center weighted or matrix. If you have backlight, so the light is behind them, then you're going to want to spot meter, okay? And then pick your ISO and aperture. And that may need to change after metering. After you're metering, you see your shutter speed is 1/50th. Then you might, I need to open up my aperture a little bit more. Because remember, aperture brings in more light. Then look through the viewfinder. Depress the shutter halfway in order to have the camera evaluate the light. So I would have done that. Then use your back scroll wheel or the one under your finger. I think with the Canon, I keep saying that, but however you do that with a Canon, I'm going to look in the answers. I'm sure somebody's already told me. And you're going to balance that meter out so it's in the middle. Then you're going to compose your shot. So once you go to compose your shot, your meter is going to be screaming at you, oh, you're way off. Don't remeter. Don't remeter. Because you have read the light where you want to read it. You have set it so that that will be well exposed. So now when you compose your shot, it might be reading something else, but don't worry about it. Okay, don't worry about it. Just press the shutter down. The meter will not look right when you go to focus on your subject. Usually it will show you that you're way overexposed or underexposed. Ignore it and take the picture. Okay. So here's a picture, and to ensure a faster shutter speed, because he's a moving target, I want a faster shutter speed. I bumped my ISO up to 640. All right, and you see my shutter speed is 1/800th of a second. This one I did go ahead and meter because he was sitting on this thing. I metered off his cheek, so even if he moved around, it was okay because I was measuring the light on him as it is right now, where he is in that spot. But he was staying still on this little digger thing in the sand pile. And then I took the picture. Here she got backlight. It's coming in behind her. So I metered off her cheek and then took the picture. You can see me in her sunglasses there. Mindful metering. Your shutter speed will change. I keep saying that, but it is so important to understand that once you've metered and then you recompose and you do it, it's going to change. How are you changing the shutter speed? By moving the back scroll wheel or whatever it is for your camera, you're telling the camera to let more light in or let less light in. Remember that shutter speed, as it gets faster or slower, the faster the shutter speed, the less light's going to make it in. The slower the shutter speed, the more light that's going to make it in. Watch your shutter speed to make sure that it does not get too slow after you've metered. If you've metered and all of a sudden you're looking at 1/10 of a shutter speed, you need to reevaluate. You need to bump up your ISO, maybe open up your aperture, bring in a reflector, change their position so that more light's hitting them. Do something. There are ways, like the picture I showed you before, I was 1/60th. I was really still, and she was a 12-year-old. I said, Sarah, don't move. If I can get back to it. Right there. So on the right, I said, Sarah, don't move. Be very still. And then I braced myself. Okay. I braced myself, pulled in my elbows. there's two methods you can, some people like to, you take a deep breath, let it out, and then some people like to breathe in again and hold it, and then they take the picture. Or some people like to take the deep breath, let it out, take the deep breath again, and then let it out, and then take the picture when they have no air in. But that first breathe in, breathe out is good just to kind of calm you down. And I am one that likes to take the picture after I breathe out and I hold my breath, and then I take the shot. And it was in focus. And the other thing is, I would hold it down, so I had several shots right in a row. So hopefully one of those was going to be in focus. But we did get it, and it was a nice shot. Let me get back to where I was. And then we're going to have time for questions. And we're going to be editing pictures that are not, that have problems in the next session, because it happens that not all pictures are perfect. Okay, here's an example. So this is my daughter, my niece, a few years back, and I was with my 85, shooting with the 85 millimeter, and with that one you have to be further back to take the picture anyway. And because I wanted to get all the horse in, I was really far back. Well, my first shot ended up being too dark. Okay, too dark. And so what I ended up doing is I had to go closer, and then I metered off my daughter's face. She's the one with the hat on. I metered off her face. Then I went back. I backed up, and then took the shot again. And so then we end up with much better skin exposure on her. And that is important. You're thinking, well, why does that really matter? Because in post-processing, we can brighten them up. Anytime you underexpose, especially the face area, we're introducing noise. So noise is that digital graininess, right? And we introduce noise when we have high ISO, although newer cameras handle high ISO really, really well. Older cameras handle it not so great. I have a couple cameras that you can't go over like 400, and then it's all graininess. So this camera I was using can handle it. I went up to, let's see, I'm at ISO 250. It's fairly bright outside, but I wanted their faces to be well exposed, because in post-processing, even if I brighten them up, then I've got some noise and graininess in there. And it wouldn't really matter with this distant shot, but if it was a close-up shot, it can be difficult to get all that out. And it's better just to go ahead and try and get it right in camera than to spend 20, 30 minutes trying to make it right in post-processing, when this little change took me all of like 30 seconds. It is worth it to try and get it right in camera than to spend a long time in editing trying to get it right. Okay, so the next thing, believe it or not, people will send pictures and say, hey, this is out of focus. How can I get it back in focus? I'm like, if it's out of focus, it's out of focus. It's out of focus. There are cameras now they have come out with that you can pick the focus later, and I think that's brilliant, but I think they're real expensive. So there are some times when it's just barely soft, and you can get those back and make them look a little sharper in post-processing. But if it's really blurry, it's done. It's a done deal. We can't go back. So take your time with focus. And so there's some things to know about focus. All right, it's the last page. So secrets to sharper pictures. Expose correctly. If it's underexposed, it's going to have that graininess, that noise to it, and it's never going to look tack sharp. So expose correctly. 2, keep your shutter speed high enough to make up for any movement you make by hand holding the camera, or your subject. They're breathing, they're moving. If they're breathing, there is some slight movement. They're not a statue. If you're taking a picture of like a landscape or something like, or a building, and still if you're breathing and moving, you don't have it on a tripod, then you need to make up for that movement, human movement, however slight it might be, make up for that by having a high enough shutter speed, or get it on a tripod. That's all I can say. Choose an aperture that fits the moment and the subject. So, wide open aperture creates beautiful bokeh, but it also increases your risk for out of focus pictures. Just because your lens can handle, 1.2, 1.4, 1.8 doesn't mean you should shoot every shot at that. And the thing to know about those wide open apertures is the depth of field is so shallow So it's going to hit something, and then everything right behind of it is going to be out of focus. Okay, everything right behind it's going to be out of focus. So be very careful with shooting at a wide open aperture. For multiple subjects, I recommend f4. I mean, for groups of 4 more, I would say f6, f5.6, f8. Focus on the eye to the front. So if the subject is tilted towards you, pick on that front eye, almost towards the nose, like right on the inside of the eye, on the nose, bridge of the nose. And it may get that second eye if the face is tilted. It may not. But, sometimes that's okay. It still works out. If you have a group, this is not in here, but I think it's in your notes. If a group, focus on the person closest to you, because twice as much focus falls back as comes forward. So if you're shooting on a group, you don't want to focus on the person in the back row, because then the people in the front row, if you have 2 and 3 rows, those people in the front row are most likely not going to be in focus. So always pick somebody in the front, because focus falls back. Focus falls back, and use a wider aperture. If you really want to use a shallow aperture like f2, then everybody needs to be in the same plane. And plane, I mean, like, if you put a piece of paper or a poster board with that person at the same as their eye, where their eye is, everybody else's eyes need to be in along that same plane, that poster board plane. I hope that's making sense. So you'd almost be able to pull a string across everybody, and it all would line up along that string, that plane, if you're going to use a really shallow depth of field. Okay. So here I was taking a picture of my 4 kids. This is years ago. They're all so big now. But the aperture was fine. The shutter speed was really too slow to capture the 2 moving kids on the bottom. So they're actually a little out of focus, whereas the top 2 kids are in focus. All right. She's laughed. My husband was behind them and made my daughter laugh. And so she moved, and then my little one looked down. And so those 2 are a little bit soft, whereas the older ones are in focus. And then on the right, so I have f2.0, and you notice that first eye is in focus, but that back eye is out of focus. It just can't handle it. It's going to stop. It can't go past that. It's just very shallow. It's not going to go very far. Last little bit about light. Light is super important. Look for the best light you can. I'll be in restaurants sometimes, and I'll say, oh man, I wish I had my camera, because this light is so beautiful. I'd love to take a picture of you or whatever, because the light is really great. And why is light so important? It affects your exposure, your shutter speed, your focus, shadows and contrast in your image. So start just saying, take your camera with you everywhere and think, okay, I'm going to look for good light. I'm going to look for good light and just take pictures of whatever is there. I've taken a picture of my salad before because the light was so nice, but I didn't have anybody else with me. I thought, well, I'll just take a picture of my salad. And because I really liked it. I was doing a 365 at that point, project 365, where you take a picture every day. Here's some different light, both really nice. One is in the shade. I had a period where I enjoyed taking pictures of fences. And then one is at sunset. And this one on the right is at the corner of my house. And so it's a homegrown picture there. This other one's like at a park. But so different lights. So the sunset is very, very warm light, very warm light. Shade, it's going to be a little bit cooler light, but it's soft, it's filtered, it's really lovely. So different light have different qualities and can meet different needs. You might have great light, but if your subject is faced the wrong way, and these are all straight out of the camera, okay? So if you see SOOC, that means straight out of the camera. Nothing's been done to them. So I was just on a trip with my daughter. This is years ago. She's about 4 years ago. And I know, anyway, I had my camera and decided to take pictures as an example. So here is the same exact light. This one, took the picture of her. She's got the buildings behind her, and I'm in front of the bushes. So then I turned around. She's in front of the bushes, and I have my back to the stores. And look at how the light affected it. So on one side, we have some shadows under her eyes and nose. And this other one, it's much more even lighting. Maybe a little too flat lighting. I should have turned her a little bit, but it was quick. We were shopping, and so I just did it. But the light is more pleasing on the one on the right than the one on the left. So a lot of times you can have great light, but your positioning is what might stink. So think about that. Types of light, filtered is lovely. Evening, you gotta be careful about the evening because it can get very, very warm and your pictures can be overly orange. So just know that you may have to do some editing in post later, and that's okay. Full sun, you know what? You can take a picture in full sun. Bump up your aperture a little bit to close down some of the light, but also put the person's back to the sun. Okay, put the person's back to the sun. That way they're going to shadow their own face. You're not going to have a bunch of shadows. They're going to shadow the entire face. And then you just meter accordingly or use a reflector to help that. Morning light, I love morning light. It's so clean. It's a very, I think it's a little bit cooler light than the sunset time. But it's soft, but early morning. I'm not talking about 10 o'clock light. I'm talking very early in the morning, and it's not too harsh. It's beautiful. A lot of times people have light they don't realize. Window and doorway light is so nice. So this is the top picture, top left picture is not this other picture cropped in. This is me I backed up and showed that I was in a doorway. This is my front door. I've got a reflector, but I moved in and took this picture. And I've taken quite a few pictures in this doorway because it just has beautiful light, and I really like it. Straight of the camera, nice light right there. But I did use a reflector to kind of fill in. I love reflectors. I think if you don't have a reflector, if you go out and buy one, I don't care if it's a $10 one, and start using it, it's the cheapest way to improve your photography, other than just going out and taking pictures. Let's see. We'll go through that. So here's some, on the left, cloudy light. Clouds are great. It's funny because when I first, before I got a camera and got into photography, I had somebody come out and take pictures of my children and my sister's children. My dad was dying. We gave him a picture of all the grandkids for his last Christmas. And the guy came out in the middle of it was like 11:30, 12 o'clock. And I was like, oh, this is great. It's blue skies, the sun's shining. Great time for pictures. He didn't tell me that it was not so great time. So now I look back at those pictures and think, man, that sun's so harsh. Look at the shadows on their faces. But I mean, maybe he didn't know then either. He's a brilliant photographer now, but he was just getting started then. So anyway, bright sun isn't the best. You can make it work, like I said, putting their back to it. But a lot of times, cloudy is a good picture day as long as it's not raining. This is my sister's family on the left, one of my sisters, and great picture with cloudy light. I love it. And then this is evening light, not that intense sunset light, which can be orange, but it's soft and gentle, and very, very nice light. Bokeh and depth of field. So bokeh is that little globes of light, right? People a lot of times will private message me on Facebook and say, how did you get all that background to be so blurry? How are you doing that? And that is using a wide open aperture, okay? And remember though, if you use a wide aperture, then you're going to have to slow down, speed up that shutter speed possibly, okay? So if you open it up, it might be affecting it. So remember, it's a balance. As you change aperture and ISO, the shutter speed is going to change. Just remember that. The closer to your subject you are, the more bokeh you're going to get. So if you're further away, you can get a lot less bokeh. The closer you are, the more bokeh you're going to get. Hopefully I have some examples. Here we go. So this is a chain. I use the exact same camera. The settings are all exactly the same. I didn't change the metering. I didn't do anything. I was using the 60mm lens. It's a macro lens, but it doesn't matter. It could have been my 50mm lens. So I focused on the chain and took the picture. I'm very close to the chain. Then I took one step back, and you can see the next one. So my very first one is the top left, and then the top right is the next one. And then I move back again. That's the bottom left. I take a step back again. So see how the trees are becoming more in focus the further back I get. The closest I am, look how it's so blurry and creamy, it almost all blends together. You can't even tell they're trees, can you? But as we move back, we can see they're trees. If you have a zoom lens, okay, so this was just with the kit lens. I was took these pictures. I was trying to use lenses that most people would have. So 55 to 200 millimeter lens is what a lot of people end up starting with a kit lens. And so these were years ago, because this son is 6'3" now. He's much taller than my husband and I. But so I took the picture at, this is 55 millimeter, so it's pulled all the way back, and you can see that the barn and the trees behind him are pretty in focus, right? I mean, they're a little blurry. They're a little blurry, but they're not creamy blurry. Then I zoomed in. So then I'm at 160 millimeters. All right, this is the zoom. Of course, my aperture went up. It's a kit lens, so it's a variable aperture. It doesn't stay the same when you like that, when I was that low. So, but still the creaminess. So look at the creaminess of the trees, and we got the beautiful bokeh back there, creaminess of the grass, and that's by zooming. I could have done the same thing if I'd kept it at 55 but moved closer to him. My feet could have done the same thing with this lens. And so back up and zoom in if you want to get that creamier bokeh or get closer to your subject. White balance. What's my time here? I can't tell my time. Hope I'm not going over on my phone. Okay, we're almost done. So white balance, so if you're getting pictures that are really orange or really blue, then maybe auto white balance is not what you need, okay? You might need to use a different preset. And if you can just use the presets in your camera. There's lots of tutorials about white balance, but just changing your preset a lot of times can give you a much better overall color. And it's the color temperature of your image. So here is one of my sons, and you can see the top left, auto white balance. He's got a bluish gray skin tone. And then I fixed it in post-processing with NPSE by doing the white dropper, eyedropper. Anyway, I could have also done that by changing the preset in my camera. Okay, but if you can't, if you're just using white balance, auto white balance, then you can fix this. But know that the top left, if your pictures look like that, they're too cool. Okay, they're too cool. I don't have time for composition. Most people know you've got angles, lines, leading lines. Change your perspective. Don't always just, have it be cookie cutter picture. So we'll go through the rule of thirds. Most people know about that. I'm trying to run through. So if you lay a grid over, that's the rule of thirds grid. You typically want your subject or like their eye to land on one of those. And some of this you can fix in post-processing. You can fix some composition in post-processing, but don't rely on that exclusively, because there'll come a time you think, oh, I'll fix it. My older sister did this. She said, I don't worry about it. I just take the picture and I'll fix it later. Well, she sent me a picture. She said, can you fix this? I was like, nope. You didn't, and there's not enough canvas to fix it. I can't make up stuff here. And I said, why, she said, I know, I'll never do that again. So try and get it as good as you can in camera, and also give yourself some space. So this was almost too close for him, but back up a little bit, give yourself some room. If you're gonna put a picture on a canvas, you actually need extra 2 inches to be able to overlap this. So this picture would never be suitable for a canvas, because most of his forehead is going to be going over the side of the canvas. So, know your purpose, if you can, of when you're taking a picture, because if you're going to put on a canvas, you need to back up a little bit more and give yourself a little more space to use. Here's rule of thirds again. So his body's lining up more on the left side of that. Her eyes are on that, the top. So the rule of thirds can be used in different ways. Okay, quality. We have RAW and JPEG, and then you have some variation of RAW plus JPEG, and you have JPEG fine, JPEG normal, JPEG basic. RAW is where you take the picture and it gathers in all the data, your camera does, and it doesn't get rid of anything. It says, oh, it's all precious to me. I'm going to keep it all. Whereas when you choose JPEG as your format, it brings it in and it says, okay, that right there, we don't need that. Cut, delete. We don't need that either. Chop, it's gone. All right, what we're left with, we're going to bundle it up with a little bit of sharpening, a little bit of color, a little bit of noise reduction, a little bit of processing, and psh, there you go. You got your JPEG. All right. And sometimes that's not great. Sometimes you end up with processing on it that you don't want. This happened to me twice over the summer. I forgot that I, for some reason, had them on JPEG, which is unusual because I don't ever have on JPEG. I had 2 shoots that were on JPEG, and I was like, oh. And I spent so much time getting off some of the processing that was on those pictures because it magnified like color cast issues or things like that were a problem. So it was not good. Shoot RAW, especially if you're working in Lightroom. Most people here in Lightroom, you edit exactly the same way. People say I'm afraid to shoot in RAW. I'm like, if you're using Lightroom, there's no learning curve. Yes, there would be a learning curve if you're in Photoshop or Photoshop Elements because you have to learn ACR a little to be able to convert it. But Lightroom is your ACR converter. So if you are using Lightroom as your editing program, please change your file format to RAW today. Yes, they're file hogs, meaning they memory card hogs. They are large files, but also pick your shots. Like don't go to a shoot and shoot 6,000 pictures just because you can. Typically, if I go to a shoot, I shoot between 100 and 200 pictures. I'm purposeful about what I do. And I think that helps make you a better photographer if you're purposeful instead of just, oh, well, I'll take it because even if it's bad, I'm not going to do something with it or whatever. I'll just shoot. To be purposeful. And then this was just a little bit ACR of what if you're using Photoshop or Photoshop Elements. And then just some little sample pictures with bokeh and choosing your focal points. All right. So let's answer some questions. Okay, Canon. Yay, Rachel. Thank you. I figured it was so on a Canon, you meter with your pointer finger, your index finger. I was pretty sure that's what it was. I almost grabbed my Canon before I came, but I didn't. And I'm sorry, Canon users. I do have a Canon 50D, and I bought it used for the purpose of being able to help people with Canons as well as Nikons, but I am primarily a Nikon shooter. And so Canon users, you're going to use your index finger, your pointer finger, and then Nikons, you're going to use your back, that wheel that's right under your thumb when you're holding your camera, where your thumb falls. It's a little wheel that goes back and forth, the scroll wheel. It's got a little track on it, and you do that. Okay. So the notes, there were notes, y'all, and I will, after I'm done with a few questions, I'll share that link, but there were some notes. Somebody asked me, a great shot, did I take this in autofocus? Not one picture that you saw today was an autofocus. I don't ever use autofocus. I do use autofocus, but it's always single. It's not where I've let the camera choose my focal points. Does that make sense? So I'm always using autofocus, but I'm always picking my focal point. I don't want to leave anything up to the camera. But as good as they are, they still need a human being to help tell them what to do. Monica asked, what is the first step I need to check if your tick mark is off to the left or right? All right, so Monica, let me just say, I'm sorry I'm going to confuse you and other people listening. If you're on a Nikon, it differs than if you're on a Canon. So if your tip marks are off to the left, either way, your goal is to get in the middle. And Canon users, I have a Canon, I've shot with it a fair amount. I found that my Canon 50D, I had to go over a couple stops, meaning I had to have have it be about 3 tick marks, maybe 2-3 tick marks to the right of the center, because if I had it right under, it was underexposed. So Canon's metering isn't as what's the word I'm looking for? It's not as correct. I'm not saying Nikon's always perfect, but it misses the mark on my Canon 50D. And when I posted that on Facebook, I had probably 50 people say they had the same problem. And once when I'm helping Canon users and I tell them, you might have to what it's going to look like you're having to overexpose a little bit to actually get it right. But I don't have to do that in my Nikon. And when it's up under the zero, it's up under the zero. So what I'm fixing to say may confuse people. So on a Canon, if your tick marks are way over to the right, that means your picture might be a little overexposed and you need to bring it back. If it's over to the left, it's saying it's a little underexposed and you need to do things to brighten up that picture to be able to bring it back to the right, okay? I'm talking about if your shutter speed is too slow and stuff like that. So the Canon's tick marks are very much like the histogram. Left, dark, right, light. Nikon users, it is the reverse, okay? Your left is bright, your right is dark. You can switch that in your menu system if you like. If thinking about it like a histogram helps you, then you can go in your menu system and switch it. I'm not going to tell you where right now because I can't remember. When you say you metered off a certain spot, does that mean you put the middle point on the camera on that spot, on that point? Tatiana, great question. If your focal point is in the center, and I can't get into everything here, but I'm a focus and recompose girl for the most part. So that means I keep my focal point in the center, okay? And then I use my back button focus, push down the focus, and then recompose. Now, some people choose their focal points and move it, but wherever your focal point is, you can meter with wherever that is at that point. So wherever it is, it can be in the top left. Just put that top left wherever that little red box is at that time, over your subject, meter. Then you can change your focus, you can do whatever, but you have told your camera how to read the light and where you want things to be for right there. Remember, once you set it, you can change the composition. But I don't go move somewhere else. Don't go 20 feet to the left and think everything's going to stay the same. You have to stay in that same spot or pretty close to it. You can move around a little bit. I'm hoping that's your question, Tatiana. But wherever your focal point is. So it doesn't matter where it is. Just use it, and then you can change it later. You're just telling the camera to read the light when I put it over it. Like, it could be a forehead. It could be, if it's a still subject, let's say it's a book, then it just depends. So, okay, a good example is if you're that dark horse. So if I was going to take a picture of that dark horse, I would not meter off the horse, because then my picture is going to be blown out bright, because it's going to read this very dark horse. So instead, I'd meter off if there was no person on the horse, I would meter off the grass, okay? Because the grass is a good neutral lighting. So I'd meter off the grass and then take the picture of the horse. But if I metered off that black horse, the rest of the whole picture is going to be blown out, because it's going to read that dark, dark horse, and it's going to think, woohoo, we got to brighten things up here. And then I would be doing that. I hope that makes sense. Tabitha, when would you recommend using a flash outdoors? That's a great question. And I have used a flash outdoors, and I have come to use it quite frequently outdoors. And that's when I'm in low light, like I'm in the shade, or my light's getting low because the sun's going down. And when I say the sun's going down, I'm not always trying to shoot sunset pictures, but I'm just have picked the evening to shoot, but the light is getting less because the sun's going down. I use a reflector, and I take the cover off, because most reflectors are a filter. So, and then they have a black and white or black and gold or white and gold or whatever. I take the cover off and I use it, and I will have somebody hold the reflector, and then I will either shoot through it to soften that light, or I'll bounce the light. So I'll shoot the flash behind me. It bounces off of that and pushes back to the person. So don't ever use a flash going straight at my subject, but I will filter it with a reflector that has, or some type of filter. But great question. My last shoot, it was a 15-year-old girl, and much of it I was bouncing or filtering flash. on the photo with the horses, did I use a tripod? Nope, that was me, and that's why they're different, because my feet were moving back and forth. I will tell people where to get the notes and in just a minute. Let's see. What mode are you shooting in to do the metering? I use manual and have it manually set to the shutter speed. So what do you use? I use Nikon. Okay, I shoot in manual. There are different modes. There's manual mode, program mode, shutter speed mode, aperture mode, and I typically shoot in manual mode almost always. And you do have to, when you say you manually have to set the shutter, that's when you're doing that by metering. So you're metering and it's changing the shutter speed. I typically don't have my mind set on a particular shutter speed. I meter, then I take a glance at that far left number and make sure it's what I need it to be. So I have a 50 millimeter on my lens on my camera right now, so I know my shutter speed needs to be at least 1/100th of a second. So if I was going to take a picture, I'm indoors, so I'm going to set my ISO to about, I'm going to say 1100. My aperture is 3.2, and so now I'll meter, and my shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. So I might think, woo, that's not going to be enough. Just let me meter off the wall. Okay, yep. And so I'll bump my ISO back up, or I'd open up my aperture and get it where I need to be, and take the picture, and then it's properly exposed. It looks great. It looks just like it does to me right now with my eyes. It's not darker, it's not brighter. There are some things you can do to help with that. I have there are times I use auto ISO. So I'm not having to think about, oh, I need to change my ISO. And that can help. So auto ISO, look into that, but I can't get into all that right now. But so there's some more advanced things you can do to help ensure that you're always getting a proper exposure. Hope that makes sense. We started at 6 o'clock Eastern time, and a lot of people don't realize that, and they don't. So if you came in at 6 o'clock Central time, then you came in late, and I apologize for that. All right, one more question, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break, and obviously I'm going to be running late. I always do for the editing portion. Okay, so what's the difference between spot metering and metering on the camera? So spot metering is just a mode, like matrix or center weighted, meaning how it's going to evaluate the light. So in spot metering, it's only evaluating the light where your focal point is right then. Okay, matrix, it doesn't care where your focal point is. It's going to read the top left, top left and right, bottom left and right, and the center. It doesn't matter where your focal point is. The center weighted doesn't matter. Your focal point would be far on the far right. It's going to read the center of your camera, where you're looking at, and then go out. And you can change how far it goes out. You can go in your settings and say, I want it to go this far out, or I want to go further out. You get to choose how far out it goes. So those are the metering modes. And then when I say I'm metering, then I'm using my thumb on a Nikon and scrolling back and forth to get my tick mark lined up under the 0, or on a Canon. And if you don't have a Canon or a Nikon, I'm not trying to leave you out. I just don't know those other cameras, and I apologize. On a Canon, I'm using my pointer finger, to scroll back and forth to get the tick mark. It's all about that little line graph in your viewfinder. When you're metering, you're moving that tick mark left or right to get up under the 0, or in the Canon example, a little over to the right. Okay, so I have to go a little over to the right. That is the metering process. When you're moving that's metering. Center weighted, spot, matrix, evaluated, those are modes. Those are how you're telling your camera to read light. Okay. One last question. What does the plus and minus on a Nikon do? Actually, it's a great question. It really depends on your camera, because if you have an entry-level camera and you hold down another button and do that, that can actually change your aperture. However, if you have the 7100 or 7000 and older, or D90, things like that, that is your exposure compensation. And so if you press down, and Canon has it as well, all the cameras do, I'm pretty sure, you press it down, and then you can go like plus 0.3, plus 0.7, plus 1. That means you're going to add light to it. And I can't say exactly the technical terms to it, but let's say it's actually a lot of people who shoot aperture will use the exposure compensation. That's what the plus and minus is. Exposure compensation to compensate, so they can add light to it or make it darker. And the pictures I shot today, which y'all may see or may not see, I actually had the exposure compensation on and to brighten it up a little bit. So that can, now I'll tell you funny stories with my D60, the very first camera I started with, Nikon D60, and I was doing fine. And what I would do to learn it, because I took one picture in auto and then I said, that's it, that's the only picture I'm taking auto, the rest of it I'm going to use this camera and learn how to use it. So I'd shoot and program, look at the settings, and then I would go change the settings manually and take the picture too. So I just figured if I kept going through the motions, eventually I would learn, and I did. Now, suddenly though, all my pictures were black, like black. No matter what I was doing, they were black. I called my friend, I don't know what's wrong, my camera's broken. So she came to see me a few days later, and she's like, well, the only thing I can think of is maybe your exposure compensation. Well, sure enough, my exposure compensation was way down to the negatives, like as far as it would go. So all my pictures were black. So somehow when I'd been playing with stuff, who knows, I had turned that exposure compensation way to the negative, and it was just, completely darkening my pictures. And so be careful about that. And I've two people I've helped had that very same problem, and I said, well, it could be this, and sure enough, it was that for them. So I was glad I experienced it. And if something happens like that to you, like your pictures are always blown out or they're always really dark, check your exposure compensation, and that may help. All right, so we're going to take a break. This was being recorded. For those who are coming asking about the